Tonight, we're pleased to have one of our region's finest botanists and conservationists with us, Naomi Fraga. So that's great that, she's up at California Botanic Garden, assistant research professor of botany at the Claremont Graduate University, and the director of conservation at California Botanic Garden. That's wonderful because that's so up her alley, as we will hear tonight. In 2021, I have to mention she was awarded the Center for Biological Diversity's E.O. Wilson Award for Outstanding Service in Biodiversity Conservation. And that's a huge award. And then following up on that, in 2023, she received the Peter Raven Award from the American Society of Plant Taxonomists. And that's given to people like Naomi who have made exceptional efforts at outreach to non-scientists. So, and I've heard some of her work in that regard. It's fun listening to her. But to think that she started at Rancho, what I still sometimes call Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, now California Botanic Garden, in 2001 as a volunteer at the herbarium. And then 2005, the master's studies in botany at the Claremont Graduate University across the street. In 2015, she earned her PhD with her dissertation on Primaceae, so the California monkey flowers. Tonight, Naomi, as mentioned earlier, will speak about using research collections and advocacy to address plant extinction crisis and more, because I know she can't be that narrowly topicked, but there's two plant species as case studies that she'll bring up at some point: Tacoma birdsbeak and a Tim's buckwheat. So both cases where right now they're in the crosshairs of conservation. So please welcome Naomi, presenting Plant Conservation in Action. And thanks, Naomi, for coming tonight.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me, Dan. And I'm really happy to speak to you all tonight. I want to just start off with a little bit of an outline. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the California flora, and which informs, my work, given what a wonderful place we live in and what a magnificent flora we have. We have to kind of start by just admiring it all. And then I want to talk about sort of how my work has grown from floristic research to taxonomic research, then creating this avenue for me to then have a platform to advance botanical advocacy. And in all these ways, like, conservation has always been a central component of my interests and my work and my motivation. So I kind of want to just draw this sort of like conservation through line in all these areas. And of course, we're all here because we're in love with California plants. And this little excerpt of sort of like a description of the complexity and beauty of California plants is sort of a summarization of Connie Millar's description of kind of the history and origins of the California flora in the Jepson Manual, where she has this sentence where it very much encapsulates it for me, where she describes it as a complex expression of geology, climate, and increasingly disproportionate human influence. So it's all sorts of things combined together that make the California flora so unique and interesting. And it's, not only these sort of physical and biological factors external from human populations, but humans are also in part of the story of the California flora. And so I just think that really captures it for me. And then, of course, we know that the California flora in part is so magnificent because of the great heterogeneity across this wonderful landscape. We have this broad geography, a fairly large state, where we have incredible topographic diversity, geologic diversity, and climate diversity. And one of the things that really makes the California flora so special is that we're one of 5 Mediterranean climate regions in the world. And all these Mediterranean climate regions in the world, like the California flora, are considered biodiversity hotspots. So we have to, I guess, chalk it up to this sort of interesting precipitation cycle of having winter precipitation and these prolonged dry summers. Certainly contributes to the incredible diversity that we have here. I mean, plants have to have so many adaptations and interesting life history strategies to avoid or adapt to this really long summer drought. You know, to have 0 water in the hottest time of the year, you have to really figure out how to live your life. And so I think that's one of the reasons California is so special. And so we know the California flora is very diverse. We have over 6,600 kinds of native plants. Over 1/3 of those are endemic to the state, and over 2,400 of them are considered rare, threatened, or endangered, or are tracked in the California Native Plant Society inventory of rare plants. So, I mean, those are, that's a lot of superlatives there, and, you know, really outpaces all the other states in our country. And then when we look at the life forms of California, we see this, you know, great diversity of life forms, but it's really the herbaceous plants that are the big players in terms of plant diversity in our state. We have a high proportion of annuals and herbaceous perennials. And while we have ecosystems dominated by shrublands and forests, in terms of total species diversity, they make up a smaller proportion of the flora. And then when we look at the life forms for the rare plants, we see it pretty much parallels the exacts. I mean, it's pretty much the same proportions. And given my interest in rare plants, I think that's why I'm drawn maybe to these herbaceous plants. It's really the teeny tiny annuals like this, pygmy poppy, the Canvia candida, that really strike my fancy. I love to, you know, look at the belly flowers and get down on my hands and knees and find the tiniest things. And California has a lot of those to offer. Oops. So despite, you know, all these sort of amazing statistics and the significance of our flora, and California being a leader in plant conservation, we truly are a leader in plant conservation. You know, just by fact that, you know, our Native Plant Society has, you know, many employees and a whole programmatic staff and all these chapters up and down the state, and each chapter or area having a conservation chair. And it's just, I mean, that's like unheard of in any other state. And we have all these tremendous resources like the Jepson eFlora, CalFlora, you know, it really, we know an awful lot about our plants, and there are a lot of plant lovers and advocates out there voicing our concern for these plants. So it's a really wonderful place to be for a plant lover. But despite this, and the fact that we have more land under protection than any other state in the lower 48 states, we're still home to the highest concentration of imperiled species outside of those areas. So it just goes to show that there's always work to do to advance conservation of these plants. And so my work in plant conservation takes place at the California Botanic Garden, as Dan described. This is the place where I was born as a botanist. I've been there for a long time now, and, you know, starting there when I was an undergraduate. And part of the reason why I'm so passionate about the work at the California Botanic Garden is because it has these incredible resources to study and advance conservation of plants, including this amazing collection of, you know, herbarium specimens, the 3rd largest in the state, but the largest in Southern California, and the best representation for California plants over any other herbarium. We also have an incredible seed bank, which we were chatting about earlier, where we have over 6,000 collections representing over 2,000 different species. And our goal is really to seed bank the California flora. And, you know, it's really great to have this genetic diversity backed up in sort of a Noah's Ark type situation. And then we have our living collection of 86 acres, which is open to the public and really serves to inspire and educate the public about California plants. So it's a tremendous place to work and carry out these conservation goals. And the institution where I work was established in 1927 by a woman named Susanna Bixby Bryant. And so this is what was happening in 1927 in Southern California. We have incredibly rapid urbanization happening across the landscape. And so when she created her institution, she did it first and foremost thinking about conservation. And these are Susanna's words, where she established the institution to preserve the native flora, to try to replenish the depleted supply of some of the rarest plants, which are rapidly being exterminated. And clearly this is, she felt this way because this is what she was seeing on the landscape. And I can only imagine, I grew up in Los Angeles County in the urban sea. But if this had been my home prior to urbanization, to see urbanization advancing at such a pace at that time, I think I also would have been alarmed and tried to, if I had the resources and wealth of Susanna Bixby Bryant, I hope I would have been able to do the same, to establish an institute dedicated to plants where we can collect them, conserve them, and promote their conservation. And here we are now in a different time, seeing sort of like a new wave of environmental change and crisis, where we're experiencing the twin crises of biodiversity extinction and climate crisis. But really, these two crises are one and the same. They're two sides of the same coin, right? Where it has been sort of rapid development and urbanization that have created the mechanisms by which we can burn and spew carbon faster and faster, and also are paving over these important carbon sequestering habitats and creating the environment where we're experiencing climate change. And then it is climate change, which is further exacerbating the extinction crisis. And sort of it's this really awful feedback loop that we're in, and we need to do all that we can to figure out how to address these both without having one further exacerbate the other. And so there was this really great paper that came out that kind of wanted to get at or summarize looking at extinctions that have already occurred to understand where we're at and kind of document what extinctions have occurred in the United States. So there are 65 documented extinctions in the United States. The majority of those, 19 of them, happened in California. And those are just the ones we know about. So these doesn't include what one might call quote unquote dark extinctions, or extinctions that are undocumented, for which had never been brought to light because those plants weren't formally documented in herbaria. And we don't have maybe passed down knowledge of those species to understand what was lost. So this is just everything we were able to document. It turns out that habitat alteration is the leading cause of all the extinctions that have happened so far. And so while we are in this climate crisis, it turns out at the same time, habitat alteration is still the leading cause. And this photograph, which comes right from all the media hits this year regarding the super bloom, the intent of this photo is to showcase the beauty of the super bloom, but we see the super bloom in a matrix in the midst of solar panels, housing developments, and all this other infrastructure. And so this is what biodiversity is contending with, is advancing habitat alteration, continued urbanization, which is only further fostering and facilitating, right? Sort of the use of fossil fuels and the climate crisis. So this is kind of where we're at, and I'm hoping my presentation is not all doom and gloom, but that maybe we can find ways to empower ourselves, or maybe we can hope to see a different future. So then how do we address this? How do we move forward? So when I think about the plant conservation toolbox, we might think about traditional ways in which we advance plant conservation. So that might include research, like floristic research or taxonomic studies, which serves to give us our basic understanding of plant diversity. We might also think about applied integrative plant conservation action that might be seed banking and restoration and these sorts of tools. And so those are the very standard sort of typical tools that is available to the botanist to advance plant conservation. And in my time working as a botanist, they are what I have availed myself of. That's the path that I've taken to work as what I considered a conservation botanist. But what I would like to sort of extend today or promote or have everyone think about is that perhaps there are additional tools that the botanist can use, including mechanisms of outreach and advocacy. So maybe that's participating in media outreach to advance the story and understanding of plant conservation to get a broader public more interested, but then also maybe participating in advocacy-like activities that involve changes in policy, land management, maybe participating in endangered species listing petitions. So I'm kind of going to go into this a little bit more at the end, but I want to kind of, I guess, talk about my personal conservation journey and kind of how I've come to this point where I'm thinking about outreach and advocacy as sort of maybe a reimagined paradigm for thinking about plant conservation. So just kind of thinking and starting with floristic studies, this is like foundational. And this is, I think, my home in botany, where, I started as a volunteer in the herbarium, and I fell in love with plants in like a plant morgue, right? Looking at the dry, dead plants. But they are incredibly beautiful specimens that serve very important roles in our understanding of very basic, like the what, the where of botany, like what exists, where does it live, when did we last see it, So it turns out that an estimated half of the world's undescribed species are still hidden in herbaria. And we can use these specimens. So, people have been collecting herbarium specimens for a couple of centuries. And we didn't anticipate all the potential use of those specimens at that time, and that these specimens would be digitized and available, where I could view specimens from France, and people in France can view specimens from California, and we can zoom in on all these, minute characteristics, and that we could look at stomatal density of plants from the 1800s and compare it to modern day plants, and think about how plants are changing in a plant morphology and phenology is changing in under a changing climate. So there's sort of like untold use of these incredible specimens. And in California, this is like one of the primary data sources we use to understand the diversity and distribution of plant species. However, many gaps still exist. So this is a map of herbarium specimens just plotted in space. And so white is an absence of herbarium specimens. And the more specimens there are, you get sort of dark colors, more blue. And so you can see there are certain areas in California, and especially here in the desert, where there are major gaps. So here, the desert as a whole in general is a gap. Southern California is amazing. Look at the urban population turns out being close to people means there's a lot of opportunities to collect herbarium specimens. Unfortunately, the Central Valley lacks documentation, but a lot of that is largely converted to agriculture. So that is perhaps represents a loss of information. But there's a lot of opportunities in the desert to increase our understanding of plant diversity. Although some of these areas may be difficult to collect because they might be under different land management, like Department of Defense, and lack access for most people. And then also at times it's been hard to collect specimens from National Park Service lands. And so the floristic research, which is basically, right, research that serves to collect the primary data of a floristic study is to collect herbarium specimens and to deposit them in the herbarium and then to describe what you collect in the form of an annotated checklist. And this provides this foundational knowledge of plant diversity, and it generates these valuable herbarium specimens. And so at the California Botanic Garden, we have a very active research program in floristics, and we have incredible students doing this work. This is what I did as a master's student. And it not only trained me as a field botanist, where I felt like a competent field botanist, but I generated this important information. And I love advising students in this kind of work because I feel like it builds the botanical workforce while simultaneously just giving us sort of instant knowledge, increase in knowledge of a very fundamental set of information that is needed. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of my students' research actually, and the incredible work they've done to advance plant conservation. So Maria, many of you might know Maria Jesus, who worked on a flora of the Southern Inyo Mountains. When she came as a prospective student to the garden, she was very interested in conducting a study where her data would be utilized towards some conservation effort. And, she became familiar with various grassroots organizations in the Eastern Sierra, Friends of the Inyo, and was able to join these coalitions and have her data utilized. And then it turns out there was a rare plant within her study site that is still directly threatened by a proposed mining operation. So this proposed gold mine on Conglomerate Mesa threatens the Inyo rock daisy, Peridoli inyoensis. And so as a part of her work at the garden, she also wrote a conservation plan for the Inyo rock daisy, and she adapted that conservation plan into a listing petition and submitted it to the state of California and the federal government to be petitioned under both Endangered Species Acts. And she actually just had some very good news this past week where the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Fish and Game Commission, they voted to list the Peridoli inyoensis. So she has had tremendous success in advancing conservation, and it all started with this floristic study. So it's wonderful to see a botanist sort of grow and advance their work with this sort of very foundational type of study. And then one of my current students is Perry Lee Pipkin, who's working on a flora of the Silver Peak Range, which is in Nevada. And this is an area that is under extreme threat. It's essentially the center of what we call the white gold rush. It's the search for lithium to advance the climate crisis. I mean, not to advance the climate crisis, to address the climate crisis, where we need, we need batteries to store energy produced by other forms of renewable energy. And so we need lithium in order to make batteries and also for electric vehicles. And so there's this great push to get this mineral. But it's sort of a free-for-all. It's definitely because it would be very profitable to have, the biggest and best lithium mine in the country. People are they're really going for it. And there are many lithium proposals, primarily in Nevada. And so this is a study that's taking place in Nevada, and Perry Lee is finding a lot of important rare plants, many state records. There's potentially an undescribed Ivesea. We don't really know if that's the case. They need to do some additional research, but they've also started a conservation plan similar to Maria. Perry Lee worked on a conservation plan for the Tecopa birdspeak. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Tecopa birdspeak, which is a plant that's near and dear to my heart, which is incredibly threatened by lithium mining proposals. So this is Chloropyron tecopense, Tecopa birdspeak. It's a rare plant that occurs in California and Nevada. I've been working with this species in California for about a decade. And then in 2018, I became curious about the populations that occur in the northern part of its range in Nevada. And that happens to be where Perry Lee's study site is. This is a groundwater dependent species. So it occurs in these alkali wetlands and desert habitats. It's threatened primarily by groundwater extraction. So basically hydrological alteration. And also there's several geothermal exploration proposals in the northern part of its range, and then these proposed lithium mines. And it actually was recently petitioned for listing by the Center for Biological Diversity because of these threats. And so we are conducting research to learn more about this species. For one, we want to know about, there's two sets of populations of this species. I've been studying the plants here in the Amargosa River Basin for some time. And like I said, I wanted to know more about the plants to the north. So the plants to the north are here in Fish Lake Valley. And these sets of populations are separated by 150 miles. And they're not hydrologically connected at all. And, so one might wonder like, well, how different are these set of populations from these populations? So we've done some preliminary research to find that there are morphological differences and ecological differences between the two. So in Fish Lake Valley, the plants occur at much higher elevation. They bloom, they finish blooming earlier, and they're tend to be shorter, and their branches are more compressed. So there's like an overall size difference. And then in the Amargosa River, the plants occur from 200 feet to 2,200 feet in elevation. They have a much longer blooming period, and they tend to be tall, highly branched plants. So right now we have a student working with us named Erica. Erica is working on a common garden study, and we're hoping, we got funding to actually conduct a genetic study. And so we're advancing sort of research to understand if these should be recognized as different taxa, different subspecies. And so when you look at a map, so I'm going to zoom into a map that's just this northern part of the population. And this is kind of where the threats are very, very concerning. So when you look at this entire portion of the range and zoom in on it, these black dots are those Chloroparantecopensi. What you see is that the entire range to the north is under various lithium mining claims. So they're both placer and lode mining claims. So the placer mining claims would likely extract water and use some technology that involves water extraction to get to the lithium. And then the lode claims focus more on like traditional hard rock mining methods. And then in addition, it's surrounded by these geothermal exploration projects here in blue. So this is the entire range of this northern range of the species that might be a distinct subspecies under threat. And that's the kind of situation we're dealing with in Nevada, where whole species or whole portions of species ranges are under threat from these projects. So we are utilizing research to hopefully advance conservation of the species. We're investigating the taxonomic status of these northern populations by conducting genetic research. We're also looking at the common garden experiment to see if those differences in morphology hold up in a common garden setting. And then we did intensive surveys this year across the distribution, and we got really good location data. Actually, this map is sort of the product of that. Prior to our work, this plant was only known from like this dot here and just like a little sliver of this dot here. And since we've been doing our work, we found it all across this area. It was unknown. These populations were unknown. And so it was not known how extensive these populations were. And another thing that we've learned is that while this area is more expansive and the plant occupies more area here, there are many more plants here. The populations are much larger in the north than they are to the south. The plants are much more diffuse down here. So this represents a very significant portion of the range. So the threats here mean that the whole species is highly threatened, whether or not they should be recognized as different subspecies. And so then to put this lithium issue into perspective, these are valid lithium claims that are attached to a company that are being tracked by my colleague, Patrick Donnelly. He's my collaborator on a lot of these projects. And there's over 120 projects of proposed lithium mines in the Western United States, and the majority of them are in Nevada. And this area where the chloropyron lives in Fish Lake Valley, this is this area here in Western Nevada. So you can see sort of, and this is the Silver Peak Range. This is where Perry Lee is conducting their study. So you can see the incredible level of threat in this area from numerous projects. And so there's different symbols here. The water symbol indicates placer claims, and this indicates load claims. And there's only one operational mine for lithium in the country, and that's this green dot right here, which is called Silver Peak in Nevada, and that's a lithium brine operation. Anyway, so it's pretty significant threat to biodiversity here in Nevada, and it's very alarming. And so it definitely needs a lot of botanical capacity to be put towards this effort. Nevada is a very sparsely populated state, and when we compare the population of botanists in California to Nevada, we have many more botanists in California than we do in Nevada. So I'm hoping, you know, California can spare me and a few other botanists so we could head over to Nevada to hopefully help build botanical capacity and advocacy there. Okay, so now I want to move on to taxonomic studies. So I want to talk about monkey flowers, because this is, I think, demonstrates how taxonomy can directly lead to conservation outcomes. So this is just to show some incredible diversity of monkey flowers, which I think explains well why I decided to study monkey flowers, because they are very striking and beautiful. And this happens to be some of the species that I worked on as a part of my dissertation. And one of the results of my dissertation work was that I described 5 new species of monkey flowers, 5 species that had not been previously, described in the scientific literature. And so I want to talk about this one, Erythranthe carcinensis. So just to know, Erythranthe palmeri and Erythranthe montuoides were the 2 species that were described. And I described these 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is one that has 2 color morphs here. So 5 species. And basically, when these are smashed as herbarium specimens, they're really hard to tell apart. So it took a lot of field work and molecular study to kind of tease these apart. And basically there was like a generic pink monkey flower and a generic yellow monkey flower, but I was able to provide more information than that. And so just to kind of get a sense of like, well, how did I determine that these were species that needed description? Was one, I looked at molecular data. This is just a tree built off of from ITS, but what it shows here is Erythranthe carcinensis, which is a species I described, resolved, many samples across its range resolved as a clade with high support, separate from Erythranthe montuoides, which was what it was called. And while they resolved separate, the relationship to one another is not resolved here. So there's more research that needs to be done to understand how they're actually related to one another. But then in addition to the molecular data, I utilized distribution data and ecology to show that these were different. So no one had ever just went and mapped these before. And they thought it was like, oh yeah, this Erythranthe montuoides occurs across, the Sierra Nevada and into Carson City. And as we know, the Sierra Nevada comes this far north, so you could think like, oh, maybe it had a continuous distribution. Except when I mapped them, I saw that there was this big break, and it turned out the plants up here occur in desert, high desert sagebrush scrub. So here is, sagebrush scrub, and the plants here occur at higher elevation in lodgepole pine forest. And so this is the Erythranthe montuides. And so, yeah, so I felt pretty good that these were different things. And it turns out that they're also morphologically different. They're both teeny tiny yellow monkey flowers, so you could see how they can be confused when they're pressed on a herbarium sheet. But Erythranthe carcinensis has these every lobe is bifid. Here you can see it's bifid, whereas here these lobes are entire. There's also other differences in the corolla shape, the orientation, and they're both pretty small, but there's some size differences as well. So Erythranthe carcinensis was described in 2012. And as I was describing the species, I was very alarmed by the state of its habitat because it occurred in Carson City amongst urban sprawl, or a growing urban area. And so I talked to the local botanists there, Jim Moorfield and Janelle Johnson, to let them know that I think this is an undescribed species, and I think it's actually fairly endangered, pretty rare, and becoming more rare because of development. They became very concerned as well, and so as local botanists, they kind of picked up this species and started doing lots of surveys. And Janelle wrote a report where she found that an estimated 42% of the potential habitat for this species had already been lost to development. And 34% of that was urban development, and 8% of that was agriculture. And so that was pretty alarming. But we did find some newly identified populations on public land. But then more, I guess, concerning things happened because some of those populations on public land. So it turns out, sometimes we think that populations that occur on federal lands have more protection than those on private lands. And that makes sense because we're like, well, people aren't going to build houses on public lands. But it turns out the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service and other agencies can actually dispose of their land. They can sell off their land holdings, which then can be developed. And that's what was happening in Carson City, is that there were these federal land parcels that the government was going to dispose of that had the Carson monkey flower on it. And because it didn't have any legal protection, they could do that. And so I think this is where I felt like my research sort of hit a wall. And while I felt very good that this species had been identified before it had gone extinct, the research only took it so far. And without legal protection, there wasn't a lot more that the research could do, right, to advance conservation of the species. So now that's where this species is. The Center for Biological Diversity is looking at petitioning it for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act, so that the populations that do remain can get actual protection. And that's my hope would be the next phase for this species. But I started thinking about sort of my botanical career, and I really love and appreciate all the work that I've done in, documenting plant populations. It's all very, very important work, but I wanted to see how could I further or advance conservation that might have more teeth. And it turns out the law has a lot of teeth. And so I wanted to see how I could get involved with botanical advocacy in relation to listing of species under the Endangered Species Act. And so that's where Teams buckwheat comes in. So this is Eriogonum teamii, Teams buckwheat. It's a friend of pollinators. You can see, you take a picture of this plant, you're not even intending to take a picture of pollinators, and there's like all kinds of interesting insects on it. There's something over here. There's this guy over here. But this is an incredible buckwheat, very resilient buckwheat that lives in the Silver Peak Range on some very highly mineralized soils. And because these soils are highly mineralized, they're have been sought after for some time for various mining operations, including boron and lithium. And so there is a proposed project that would mine essentially the entire range of the species eventually. So the project is called the Rhyolite Ridge Mine, and this is these are their sort of plans for their project, their mining project. And what we're looking at here is the range of the buckwheat is these little green blobs here. And then it has been listed as endangered by the federal government. That happened in 2022. And I was a part of that campaign. So that felt really good to get legal protection for this species. And anyone who signed on to our work, I thank you for really helping to advance conservation of this species. So it's listed under the Endangered Species Act, and critical habitat has been designated. And that's what this green buffer is here, is the critical habitat designation. And so the mining company kind of reformatted their plans, and they say, well, we entirely avoid the buckwheat, and we're not going to mine any of the buckwheat's habitat, except that their open pit quarry comes within 12 feet here of the buckwheat. So, I mean, I don't know what that means. You know, maybe by the letter of the law, they're saying they're avoiding the buckwheat, but they're really not. And 40% of the critical habitat would be impacted directly by their mining operation. And so the critical habitat is what's determined as essential for its long-term survival under, as defined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act. And then this is just the first phase of the project, and they would have phase 2, which would take up essentially like 90% of the population. So this was the situation the species was in, you know, before endangered species listing, and it's actually still the situation because this mine is still proposed and it's undergoing environmental review. And we're hoping that now that there's legal protection, that there are avenues to kind of like enforce protection essentially. Whereas without legal protection, there's nothing stopping the Bureau of Land Management from permitting this mine. It really requires the law to stop the Bureau of Land Management to stop them from permitting the mine. So how did I engage in advocacy? Well, I worked with the Center for Biological Diversity on their Endangered Species Act petition. And as documents were coming out, I provided scientific review and comment on those documents as the mining company was putting out the proposed plans. I went out and monitored the buckwheat monthly for a couple of years because every time we went out there, there was always something fishy going on. And so we wanted to make sure to document all those activities. I requested a lot of action from other scientists. And so I utilized social media and other methods to ask scientists to sign on to public comment letters. I asked people to join a public meeting, and we asked people to buy team buckwheat t-shirts, which they did. And we all like showed up to the meeting. It was a virtual meeting, but we were all wearing our t-shirts, and it was great. And I responded to lots of media inquiries, and I've written at least 2 op-eds about Teams Buckwheat in Nevada papers. So it turns out Teams Buckwheat is the most famous buckwheat in the world now, with over 100 media hits or more. It's been in CNN News, CBS News, ABC, and there's a really great story in Wired magazine that if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read. The lithium mine versus the wildflower, and it's about botanical advocacy essentially. So this was kind of my foray into working with the media to get the word out on the need for plant conservation, and then it carried over into the super bloom. And so I did have the opportunity to sort of expand on messages of conservation for the super bloom this year, and had this story in the Washington Post and a story in the New York Times, really to promote the idea of stewardship and care. And so this is just a quote from me from an article in The Guardian. And yeah, and so there were lots of opportunities to communicate about why plants are important and why we need to be mindful and be good stewards to protect them. And so I just kind of, as I'm rounding this out, I do think that we can accomplish plant conservation from a lot of different angles. I think scientific research, it remains important. I'm not saying we have to ditch the science and just all, and, you know, kind of get our protesting, you know, energy on and be hard, you know, sort of rigorous advocates. But we do need good science, but we also, I think, many people who are involved in the plant conservation world, I think we can lean in a little more in thinking about how we can advance sort of better policies and legal protections for plants, because sometimes like status quo is not enough. And media messaging, I think, is a big part of that, because that gets to sort of lawmakers, right? To understand that this is actually all the news surrounding the super bloom and King's buckwheat, I think, demonstrates that plants, it's not just some niche sort of thing that we as Native Plant Society participants, you know, we get to talk about plants and we love plants and we feel like we're this sort of secret club, but really it's a broader cultural conversation that people are paying attention to. And we have the opportunity to put those messages out there to demonstrate how important it is that we have strong laws and policies, and that it's not just, so what, it's just one plant, but what are, how consequential is it, and how important plant conservation is. And then also just want to think about a scientist's role in listing petitions, because we need more listing petitions. When we look at the number of plants listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act since 2013, we see we have some spikes. These spikes are primarily from Hawaiian plants. That were years where many Hawaiian plants got listed. But you can see in more recent years, especially during Trump's administration, there has been a paucity of plants added to the Federal Endangered Species Act. And this, right, seems counterintuitive because we're in a time of biodiversity crisis and extinction crisis. We should have more plants listed under the Endangered Species Act as we have more plants threatened with extinction. But that's not the case. So we need to kind of fight through these log jams and find ways to advance listing of plants. And also to kind of depoliticize it and, you know, make it normal for a scientist to really participate in this process. So I just want to close out and say that I think that on one hand, there's a lot that people can do for plants that, you know, as people interested in plant conservation, we think of ourselves as sort of people who care for plants and steward plants. But then I also think we need to kind of like roll it back and think about plants themselves and how plants themselves have an incredible amount of agency, right? Like plants made the world habitable for us as humans. They oxygenated the planet and they have provided everything that we need to live our lives. And so they themselves have like world making abilities and agency. And so I think that just by thinking about that, maybe it helps us draw a greater respect for plants and their awesomeness and their importance in the world. But then I also think that even though there's a lot of doom and gloom out there, we have to think about the responsibilities we have as people in the present, where the future is not written yet. And while we are descendants, you know, and we benefit from all of our forebears who, you know, created the Endangered Species Act and the Desert Conservation Act and wilderness areas and all these sort of mechanisms for conservation. And we benefit from the work of the people who came before us. We also are, right, the future, and we are the ancestors of the future, right? There are descendants who come after us. And so the future hasn't been written yet, but we are responsible for it. So I think we need to exercise our agency and do the best that we can. So with that, I thank you. Stop my share.
Okay, what we'll have to do, people, if you have questions, please put it in the chat. And we'll probably have Naomi looking through there. Ron had one in earlier, 10 minutes ago. Can you see that, Naomi? Do you want to
Yeah.
ask? answer
Oh,
that?
wait,
Okay.
hold on. Okay. So the chlorpyrrole was only petitioned for Federal Endangered Species Act right now. It could be considered for also California Endangered Species Act as well. And so if the two, that's one thought, is that if they should be recognized as two species, you think that would sort of increase the chances of listing. But even still, we think that the threat is so significant to the north, and it really constitutes a significant portion of the range, that whether or not they get split up, listing is warranted, although it does kind of put into clear view the significance of the threat of the northern population. But I think that regardless, it stands a good chance of getting listed without the taxonomic changes. And so for the taxonomic changes, it's kind of a curiosity project, and just wanting to understand sort of like the history there and how long these things have been separated, and learning more about their natural history.
Okay, then I'll take an advantage of this little gap here. So you said having data is a useful step in legal conservation. So that's good. And then you show us areas in the desert that are lacking herbarium records. Is there a strategy to determine which areas could be filled up?
I think just you could do that sort of spatial analysis by just mapping the herbarium records that exist, to identify what we call them as botanical black holes. And then, we need to funnel students to them and kind of have sort of like pitch projects, to people.
Well, you had mentioned that there's a couple more steps and challenges here, depending on who owns the land.
Yeah. So for instance, Fort Irwin is a botanical black hole, and that is a really hard thing to overcome when it's Department of Defense lands, especially when there's unexploded ordnance around. And like China Lake is another one that we've had students be interested in, but then when we consulted with them about the opportunities to do surveys on the base, we would have to pay a chaperone $200 a day in order to get access, and you have to like plan it well in advance, and there just would be like very few opportunities to even get in there. So maybe there's fewer opportunities, but if there could be, maybe there was a time when some of our botanists did an expedition in the Chocolate Mountains Gunnery Range. So maybe there could be, rather than sort of full-length studies that are multi-year, maybe sort of like occasional expeditions that are maybe guided or chaperoned by military personnel could provide some opportunities for documentation. So Dan asked about dark.
While we were talking,
Oh,
got
sorry.
two more. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay, let me look at the first one. If it's more challenging to get the public interested in conservation of smaller herbaceous plants as opposed to larger trees, that is a very good question, because there is a lot of money for tree conservation, and like tree planting is something that a lot of people can get behind. It's like, oh, it's kind of a feel good kind of a project, and especially plants that lack a certain charisma to a broader public. So the Center for Plant Conservation did some analysis of our seed banking efforts, and they used a metric of what they called plant apparency to see if showier plants got seed banked more than kind of more modest, sort of less showy plants. And indeed, there was an effect on the plant apparency where sort of, even if they're annual or herbaceous, sort of like penstemons or Cambia candida, things that people like get really excited about, had a tendency to be seed banked more than, say, like tiny cryptantha or something like that. So it's unfortunate, and so we have to work. We have to force out our biases and kind of look at conservation need or other metrics in order to, I think, prioritize our work rather than what we want to see in the field and look at. So dark extinctions, gosh, you can't quantify. There's like no way to quantify dark extinctions because they're essentially gone extinct without any trace, right? They've kind of like, we weren't able to document them, but it could be, I mean, when you think about like, I think about Greater Los Angeles. So one species we know that went extinct in Greater Los Angeles is the Los Angeles sunflower. It lived in marshes and springs and cienagas, and all those habitats have been altered. That's just total hydrological alteration. Those habitats no longer exist. That plant is totally extinct. But when we think about how complex and diverse our region is, so we know that there are very different species in Orange County compared to San Fernando Valley, right? Just in that short span. And so when we think about the whole of the greater Los Angeles urban area and all that urbanization, there had to have been more species that went extinct, right? That were endemic to our area because we have high levels of endemism. We have species that occur in just really narrow bands. And so I don't know, but I could imagine that there were tens that we don't know about, What other groups can we advocate with? Well, the California Native Plant Society also puts forth listing petitions. And they've been responsible for several state listing petitions. And in fact, the petition for the Inyo rock daisy was one put forth in partnership with the Center for Biological Diversity and the California Native Plant Society. So the California Native Plant Society worked on that one as well. So I would say the state, Nick Jensen at the state would be a good person to be in touch with. To talk about listing petitions.
You see the question just above Susan's.
Oh, yes. Recommendations, preference on how citizen scientists can help fill black holes. So yeah, that's a really great question. And Chloe, I know you're really big on iNaturalist, and that is really great. So iNaturalist is incredible because I have learned so much about monkey flowers through iNaturalist, including like new occurrences, morphological variation. People are documenting incredible things. And I think iNaturalist has a lot of potential to bring forth a lot of information to help bring that information to scientists, provided that the scientists are on there. Like I'm kind of on there sporadically, but when I am on there, I'm learning a lot and I'm seeing a lot of things that I would like to see in the field, or if I don't have time to see them in the field, the herbarium specimen, like I said, like they're very one-dimensional, right? They're flattened specimens, but then to be able to see those 3D and through other people's photographs is really valuable information. So I do think that CalFlora and iNaturalist have great potential to help advance our knowledge overall. I think those are great tools.
And I think that is a good point to slow down, wind down for the night. So if everyone can use their reactions, emoticons, or if you've unmuted, then go ahead and thank Naomi for joining us tonight, bringing us up to date on these subjects on conservation and monkey flowers and mining in Nevada, the whole bit. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then
Thank you, Naomi.
Yeah.
Thank you, Naomi. I'll see you at SoCal.
Oh yeah. Southern California Botanist. I think Ron had mentioned that it is on Saturday. Our topic is I'll Take My Plants Rare, and we have an incredible lineup of speakers. And so you can find me there because I'm going to be manning our merchandise booth. We're selling t-shirts. I was president a long time ago. I don't think I could be president anymore. I'm tired. I don't know that I have the time, but we have a good group at SoCal. I'm the secretary.
Excellent.
And you sleep about 2 hours a night or something with all the other things you do? Wow. Okay, then we are done for the evening. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. Of course, we had a good speaker and that helps bring people in. Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks.